They sold a perfect lie until the world heard what was never meant to be recorded. Ella adjusted her tailored blazer for the 5th time in 10 minutes, straightening a stray strand of chestnut hair as she scanned the chaos of the press room. The room buzzed with cameras, microphones, and assistants scurrying in every direction, but Ella's practiced calm made it seem as if she could orchestrate the storm with a mere flick of her wrist. Her phone vibrated relentlessly, notifications flashing like warning lights. Emails from her agency, reminders about family fund deadlines, and a flurry of media alerts. Every detail of her life had once been neatly compartmentalized, until now. Across the room, Jackson stormed in, dark hair mussed, a scowl permanently etched into his otherwise striking features. Photographs of last night's club brawl had already gone viral, and the studio's ultimatum had been delivered. Repair your public image in 6 weeks, or lose your lead role in the summer blockbuster. Jackson's gait was chaotic, almost defiant, as though the world itself had wronged him personally, and he intended to make them pay. The two collided figuratively and literally at the center of the press room when Ella's assistant tried to introduce herself. "Jackson, this is Ella, your PR manager," the assistant said, voice barely audible over the noise. Jackson's eyes flicked to her, and he quirked an eyebrow, a mix of amusement and derision. "PR manager, huh?" he said, voice low but sharp. "So, you're the one responsible for keeping me from imploding publicly?" Ella's jaw tightened. "And you're the one who made sure I'd have a month of headaches," she retorted, eyes flashing with controlled irritation. Their initial impressions crystallized instantly. Jackson saw her as a rigid, corporate enforcer, a robot in a tailored suit, while she regarded him as an unruly, spoiled actor with a penchant for self-destruction. The assistant awkwardly retreated, leaving the two of them in a bubble of escalating tension. Cameras snapped incessantly around them, flashes reflecting in Jackson's dark eyes and catching the sheen of Ella's polished skin. She reminded herself that every gesture, every smile, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized online, dissected for tone and intent. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to maintain composure. Jackson, meanwhile, leaned against a counter, arms crossed, scanning the room as though he were already above it all. He smirked at the cluster of photographers and whispered under his breath, "And they call this work?" Ella's phone buzzed again, the studio confirming that the PR strategy must begin immediately, with formal appearances and staged interviews scheduled 3 times a week. The stakes were immediate and high. Without a thought, Ella mapped the next steps in her mind, compartmentalizing Jackson's unruly tendencies, the studio's expectations, and the precarious state of her family fund. Jackson, sensing her internal calculation, smiled with a mixture of admiration and irritation. "You think you can tame me in 6 weeks?" he asked, tone teasing, yet laced with challenge. Ella's eyes narrowed. "I don't tame," she said firmly. "I manage." The friction between them was instantaneous and electric, a collision of worlds. His impulsive, fame-driven chaos against her meticulous, controlled precision. The first hour passed in a blur of introductions, media briefings, and tense silences punctuated by sarcastic remarks from Jackson and clipped, precise instructions from Ella. She found herself calculating every movement, noting how he shifted his weight, the way his gaze lingered for just a moment too long, and the subtle ways his charm disarmed even seasoned photographers. Jackson, in turn, observed her restraint, the precision of her responses, and the underlying current of authority that she wielded without arrogance. By midday, the PR briefing concluded, leaving both of them exhausted yet acutely aware of the fragile, charged dynamic that had formed. Ella stepped into the quiet of her office, closing the door behind her, and allowed herself a rare moment of exhale. She knew the days ahead would test every ounce of her discipline. Jackson, roaming the corridors with a half-smile, knew the next 6 weeks would challenge everything he thought he knew about public image and about Ella. Neither could predict that the chaos of their first encounter would sow the seeds of something far more complicated than contracts and appearances, an unpredictable collision of ego, vulnerability, and, potentially, unacknowledged attraction. Ella sat at the sleek conference table, the polished wood gleaming under the soft studio lighting. Across from her, Jackson lounged casually in an oversized chair, a careless smirk playing on his lips, as if the fate of his career, and perhaps hers, were merely accessories to his amusement. On the table lay a thick stack of papers, the contract that would bind them for the next 6 months, the agreement that made her the official girlfriend of one of Hollywood's most unpredictable stars. Ella exhaled slowly, her pen poised, aware that each signature represented more than legal obligation. It was the fragile tether between financial necessity and personal integrity. The studio's legal counsel leaned forward, emphasizing each clause with the precision of a seasoned predator. No sexual contact beyond staged appearances, the lawyer recited, eyes flicking between them. 3 public outings per week, documented and photographed. Social media posts as required, Instagram captions pre-approved. Breach will result in immediate termination and financial penalties. Jackson raised an eyebrow, voice dripping with mock surprise. And here I thought dating you would be fun. Ella's eyes narrowed. This isn't dating. This is work. And I assure you, I perform better than most. He chuckled softly, the sound carrying a mixture of disbelief and fascination. You really do take this seriously, huh? She didn't answer, simply signing the first page and sliding it across the table. Jackson mirrored her action with a languid flick of his wrist, eyes never leaving hers. The tension was palpable, 2 worlds colliding, her meticulous, disciplined life and his chaotic, fame-driven existence. As the final page was signed, Ella felt a pang of conflict. The enormous fee promised to her family fund was a lifeline, but at what cost? She would live under constant scrutiny, her every move analyzed, her autonomy subtly compromised, all for the sake of contractual performance. Jackson, conversely, seemed almost amused by the restrictions, his rebellious nature chafing against the confines of the agreement. So, Miss Manager, he said, leaning back with a sly grin, when do I start following your rules? Ella's gaze sharpened. You don't. You follow the contract. I manage the optics. You comply, or you lose your career. The weight of that reality sank in, and for the first time, Jackson's smirk faltered into a thoughtful frown. They both understood the stakes. One misstep, one careless comment, and the tabloids would pounce, the studio would withdraw support, and the delicate balance of public perception would crumble. Over the next few hours, they rehearsed staged appearances and social media protocols. Jackson tried subtle deviations, gestures that might appear spontaneous or irreverent, but Ella countered each with firm guidance, maintaining her role as strategist. Remember, she said, pointing to a planned Instagram post, authenticity sells, but it must be controlled authenticity. Any hint of real tension or rebellion will be magnified tenfold. He nodded, though his eyes sparkled with mischief, betraying the internal resistance he felt to her meticulous planning. As the evening descended, they walked through the studio's red carpet simulation, practicing smiles, angles, and timed laughter. Jackson occasionally teased, challenging her instructions, but she remained unwavering, her confidence a firm anchor in the storm of his charisma. Yet beneath the calculated smiles and staged interactions, a subtle tension began to develop, an unspoken recognition that there was more to each other than the roles they had been assigned. Ella caught glimpses of Jackson's vulnerability when the cameras weren't watching. A fleeting moment of frustration, a sigh, a look of weary determination. Jackson noticed her controlled composure, the way she anticipated every potential mishap, and the fierce dedication underlying her professional demeanor. Though both outwardly maintained a veneer of transactional detachment, a quiet, electric undercurrent threaded between them, the first hint that their contract could ignite something unforeseen. That night, Ella returned to her apartment, reviewing the contract and rehearsal footage, noting every microexpression, every moment of deviation from the planned optics. She realized that the task ahead would require not only strategic acumen but patience, psychological insight, and an unusual tolerance for chaos. Jackson, in his penthouse suite, sat staring at his phone, scrolling through rehearsal clips. For once, he was not thinking of tabloids or drinks or impulsive fights. Instead, he pondered the enigmatic precision of Ella's approach, the way she navigated his volatility with a subtle yet undeniable authority. Both were acutely aware that this agreement, designed as a simple professional arrangement, was already testing boundaries they hadn't anticipated: control, attraction, and the uneasy tension between obligation and curiosity. By the time the city lights blinked against the dark sky, they were no longer merely two individuals bound by contract. They were players in a complex dance of optics, strategy, and, unknowingly, the first fragile sparks of a far more complicated relationship. The night air was electric as the sleek black limousine pulled up to the entrance of the gala, its polished surface reflecting the twinkling city lights. Flashbulbs ignited the moment the doors opened, and the press swarm descended like a living tide, cameras clicking relentlessly. Ella adjusted the strap of her gown, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. Her heart raced, not from the glamour, but from the anticipation of managing Jackson under live-fire conditions. He emerged from the car with all the chaotic charm of a storm. Hair tousled, jacket slightly askew, a half-smirk that suggested both defiance and amusement. "Looks like the circus is here," he muttered, voice low, audible only to her. Ella's eyes narrowed. "And you're the main attraction," she replied, steadying her posture. The photographers swooped in, shouting names, demanding poses, snapping shots before either of them could react. Jackson instinctively posed, but with his own improvisation, leaning too close, grinning at her like a conspirator rather than a client. Ella felt a jolt of irritation. He was breaking all the boundaries she had meticulously rehearsed. "Jackson, smile, but do not tilt your head too much," she instructed sharply, holding up her hands to guide him. He rolled his eyes, but subtly followed her gestures. Yet, even as he complied, his charm made the controlled movements appear spontaneous. The first interview began, a flurry of questions about the upcoming film, his recent controversies, and, inevitably, their relationship. Ella answered smoothly, every phrase calculated to frame him positively, to contain the narrative, and to protect both their reputations. Jackson, however, interjected with impromptu humor, teasing the journalist lightly, making the scripted answers sound more human, more relatable. Ella blinked, startled by the effect. The reporter laughed, the tone softening. In that brief exchange, she realized that his irreverence, while difficult to manage, had a natural charisma that she could never replicate. "You see," he whispered as they stepped away from the microphone. "Sometimes chaos works." Ella suppressed a sigh. "Sometimes it ruins everything." The night pressed on, a gauntlet of flashing cameras, fans, and reporters. At one point, a particularly intrusive photographer shoved a microphone toward Jackson, demanding a scandalous quote. Jackson froze, then instinctively looked to Ella. "Handle this," he said, smirk fading into seriousness. Ella leaned in, whispered a clever redirection, and he parried the question with a quip that made the reporter laugh instead of provoke. She couldn't help but notice the subtle thrill of control in the chaos, the first inkling of a respect that went beyond contractual obligation. Yet the tension remained. In moments of proximity, Jackson's presence was magnetic, his casual defiance brushing against her meticulous control, creating a current neither could ignore. After what felt like hours, the gala ended. They retreated to a quiet side corridor, away from the flashes, the questions, and the public gaze. Ella's posture relaxed slightly, though her mind raced through every misstep and improvisation that had occurred. Jackson leaned against the wall, smirking again, though the fatigue in his dark eyes betrayed him. "Not bad," he said, voice softening. "You kept me from completely embarrassing myself." Ella allowed a faint smile, reluctant to admit the flutter of satisfaction at his compliment. "And you didn't make me pull out my hair once," she replied evenly. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but charged, an unspoken acknowledgement that the night had revealed more than either had expected. Jackson's gaze lingered on her face, catching the faintest hint of admiration beneath her professional composure. Ella felt it, the subtle shift in energy, and for the briefest moment, the red carpet, the cameras, the chaos, all disappeared. They were just two people, locked in the fragile dance of initial connection, bound by necessity, yet beginning to understand one another in ways no contract could dictate. The night ended with their separate exits, Ella heading back to her apartment to meticulously document the evening's outcomes, Jackson disappearing into the city lights, but the spark lingered. A tension that was equal parts friction and fascination, anticipation and unease, had been ignited. Both knew the coming weeks would test boundaries, force compromises, and challenge every carefully constructed rule. Yet neither could deny the first undeniable truth. This partnership, born of obligation and circumstance, had the potential to become something far more complex than either had anticipated. The morning after the gala, the office was unusually quiet, the hum of computers and muted chatter a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Ella poured herself a coffee, scanning the latest headlines on her tablet. Jackson's images were everywhere, flashes of smiles, ill-timed jokes, and candid moments from the red carpet. Most praised his charm, but several outlets hinted at underlying tension, questioning the authenticity of his relationship with Ella. A soft knock on her office door made her glance up. "Come in," she said, already anticipating it was her assistant with another scheduling update. Instead, the door opened wider than expected, revealing a tall, impeccably styled woman with a dazzling smile and an air of calculated ease. "Ella," the woman said, her voice smooth, almost sing-song, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ella froze for a moment, recognition flickering in her eyes. Stella, Jackson's ex, the queen of reality TV, known as much for her manipulative charisma as for her sparkling public persona. "Stella," Ella replied cautiously, rising from her chair. "I didn't expect to see you here." Stella's eyes glinted with a mixture of charm and veiled challenge. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, of course," she said, taking a slow step into the office. "I simply wanted to offer my congratulations. You and Jackson, quite the spectacle last night." Ella's smile was tight, controlled. "Thank you." Stella's gaze lingered just a beat too long, studying her, measuring, assessing. She moved closer, voice lowering. "But if you ever wonder what you're really up against, remember, he's complicated. And not everyone is as harmless as they seem on the red carpet." Ella felt a ripple of unease. Her instincts screamed that Stella's visit was not about courtesy, but reconnaissance. "I'm sure I can manage," she said evenly, refusing to show weakness. Stella's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Oh, I don't doubt your skills. But sometimes, the people who appear most in control are the easiest to unbalance." The warning was subtle, yet unmistakable. With that, Stella pivoted gracefully, letting her designer heels click against the floor, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume and the undeniable sense that she had just delivered a psychological jolt. Over the next days, Ella noticed subtle shifts. Paparazzi questions seemed tailored, stories began to hint at Jackson's instability, and small, calculated rumors surfaced online. It became evident that Stella was systematically probing, testing both Ella's composure and Jackson's reactions. Meanwhile, Jackson seemed oblivious to the calculated manipulation. He joked about the new headlines, brushing off subtle digs with charm and humor, as if daring the world to rattle him. Ella, however, noted the micro-expressions, fleeting looks of doubt, brief hesitations in interviews, the way he sometimes glanced toward the office entrance as though anticipating an unseen observer. One evening, as they reviewed social media analytics and interview footage, Ella finally voiced her concern. "Jackson," she said cautiously, "there's someone working behind the scenes, feeding the media. I think it's Stella. She's strategic and dangerous." Jackson leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Stella? She's always been a storm in a bottle. But she's just a shadow from the past. Let her play her little games. I'm not giving her the satisfaction of panic." Ella stared at him, seeing both his bravado and the faint edge of uncertainty beneath. She realized that managing Jackson's public image was no longer about mere appearances. It was also a psychological battle, one she hadn't fully anticipated. The tension between them deepened, not in the sparks of attraction that had begun on the red carpet, but in the silent understanding that their partnership would be tested in ways far beyond contracts or staged appearances. Over the next few days, Ella noticed how subtly Stella's presence permeated their routines. Whispered comments in interviews, staged encounters at events, and offhand compliments laced with barbs. Each action was calculated to unbalance, to provoke reaction, to expose weakness. Jackson occasionally laughed off her machinations, but Ella could sense that even he was responding subconsciously, flinching at hints of past scandals resurfacing. By the end of the week, Ella realized that the challenge ahead would not merely be managing Jackson's public image, but defending him, and herself, against a calculated adversary who knew exactly how to push buttons. In the quiet of her office that Friday evening, reviewing the week's coverage, she whispered to herself, "This isn't just PR anymore. This is war." And somewhere, across town, Jackson sent a casual text with a single emoji, a smirk that, unknowingly, mirrored the tension simmering between all three of them. The game had changed, and both of them, bound by contract, obligation, and necessity, were now unwilling participants in a battle neither could predict, setting the stage for the subtle, psychological chess that would define the weeks to come. The countryside stretched out like a calm painting as Ella's car wound along the tree-lined roads, leaving the chaos of the city far behind. The mansion they were headed to, a spacious, secluded retreat owned by the studio, promised quiet, privacy, and, most importantly, no press. Ella sat in the passenger's seat, fingers tapping the armrest in a nervous rhythm, aware that this working getaway was as much about optics as it was about proximity. Jackson drove with a relaxed confidence, music playing softly, the windows down to let in the crisp evening air. "I hope you know what you're doing," Ella said, her tone firm yet tinged with unease. "Managing me?" he asked, smirking, eyes briefly meeting hers in the rearview mirror. "No," she replied, straightening her back. "Managing the optics. And keeping you from turning every quiet moment into a headline." Jackson laughed lightly, a sound that blended mischief with an unexpected warmth. "Challenge accepted," he said. For the first few hours at the house, the tension was palpable. They unpacked, organized schedules, and reviewed the media plans, a flurry of activity that left little room for small talk. But as the evening deepened and the sun dipped behind the hills, a stillness settled over the mansion. No cameras, no assistants, no flashing lights, just the two of them. Jackson leaned against the balcony railing, gazing at the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "people think they know me, but none of them see what it's really like." Ella, cautiously, took a seat nearby. "And what is it really like?" she asked. Jackson hesitated, his usual bravado slipping for the briefest moment. "Exhausting. All the time performing. Everyone expects chaos or charm, never normalcy. It gets lonely." Ella felt a pang of empathy, a crack in the wall she had maintained around her professional detachment. "I know that feeling," she admitted softly. "Living your life as a checklist, everything controlled, every move calculated. Sometimes it feels like the only thing you can rely on is yourself." Silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, almost intimate, the kind of shared understanding that did not require gestures or forced laughter. Gradually, the barriers between contract and reality began to blur. Jackson admitted, with a wry twist of his lips, that last night's improvisations had scared him more than he'd care to admit, that he respected the way she anticipated chaos and turned it into strategy. Ella listened, noting the vulnerability in his tone, realizing that the man behind the headlines was far more complex than the tabloid caricature. She, too, allowed herself to open a fraction of the personal armor she usually kept hidden. She confessed her fear of losing control, not just over her professional life, but over her personal boundaries, a rare admission, especially in the presence of someone as unpredictable as Jackson. Their conversation stretched into hours, moving from career frustrations to childhood memories, favorite books, and the small absurdities of life that rarely made it into their public personas. For the first time, they interacted not as PR manager and client, but as two people discovering common ground. As night fell, the stars scattered across the clear sky above the estate. Jackson broke the silence with a small, genuine laugh. "I never thought I'd enjoy this kind of peace," he said. Ella smiled faintly. "Neither did I. But it's refreshing, isn't it?" The evening ended without staged photo ops, without social media posts, without the omnipresent pressure of public perception. In those hours, the contract seemed to fade, and the space between them, once defined by rules, schedules, and obligations, began to shrink. Yet beneath the calm, both were acutely aware that this newfound connection existed in fragile territory. Stella's presence, the looming press, the studio's scrutiny, all of it still hung over them like a silent storm. But for the first time, They had glimpsed each other beyond the performance, each realizing that the walls they had built around themselves were slowly starting to crumble. In the quiet of the countryside, with nothing but the sound of night and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, Ella allowed herself to acknowledge that Jackson was not just a challenge to manage. He was a person worth understanding, someone whose vulnerabilities mirrored her own. And Jackson, observing her composed demeanor softened by honesty, recognized a spark of authenticity he had never seen in anyone in Hollywood before. That night, neither of them spoke of contracts, media, or obligations. They simply existed in the same space, sharing the rare, unguarded experience that would quietly reshape the dynamics of the coming weeks. The morning sun poured through the wide windows of the countryside house, casting golden light across the wooden floors and the scattered remnants of last night's quiet conversation. Ella stretched, sipping her coffee while reviewing the day's social media plan, a document that now felt oddly trivial compared to the honesty shared yesterday evening. Jackson emerged from the hallway, bare feet padding against the polished floor, hair still slightly tousled from sleep. "Morning," he said casually, leaning against the doorframe, his usual mischievous grin softened by something warmer, more human. Ella looked up, momentarily caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. "Morning," she replied evenly, though her chest betrayed a subtle quickening. Today's agenda was supposed to be strictly professional, a staged photo shoot in casual wear at a nearby cafe, designed to appear spontaneous, yet carefully choreographed for their social media campaign. Jackson tilted his head, a teasing glint in his eyes. "And here I thought today was going to be boring." Ella's lips pressed together. "It will be as long as you follow the plan." He smirked. Define follow the plan. Hours later, they arrived at the quaint cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the town. Cameras were present but discreet, journalists instructed to photograph only pre-approved angles. Yet, unlike the red carpet, the pace was slower, the air lighter. Jackson kept up a casual banter, improvising small, endearing gestures that made Ella laugh despite herself. At one point, he picked up her coffee cup and pretended to taste it, exaggerating a grimace. "Tough morning brew," he quipped. Ella's laughter broke freely, genuine and unguarded, a sound she rarely allowed in public. "Not nearly as bitter as your jokes," she shot back, though the warmth in her eyes betrayed her enjoyment. The morning stretched into afternoon, and their staged interactions subtly shifted. Tasks initially designed for optics became moments of shared presence. Jackson, noticing a stray dog outside, crouched to pet it, prompting Ella to smile with a spontaneity she hadn't anticipated. The barriers between contract and reality blurred further when, at the end of the shoot, Jackson suggested an unplanned detour to a small, tucked-away bookstore. "No cameras, no scripts. Just us," he said quietly, as if testing the fragile boundary. Ella hesitated. The professional in her screamed caution, but the person who had glimpsed Jackson's vulnerabilities yesterday urged agreement. "Fine," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. Inside the bookstore, the world felt suspended. Rows of books created a private labyrinth where no one could intrude. Jackson wandered along the aisles, pulling out titles with curiosity, occasionally making her laugh with his humorous observations. Ella found herself revealing small details about her life, the fears she had once kept hidden, stories from her childhood, snippets of family struggles she had never shared with colleagues. Jackson listened, genuinely interested, his usual defiance replaced by attentive focus. At the back of the store, near a sunlit corner, their conversation lulled. For the first time, words were unnecessary. Jackson looked at her, eyes soft, searching. Ella met his gaze, sensing the weight of the moment, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was no longer acting, no longer performance. He leaned closer, tentative but deliberate. "Ella," he murmured, voice low. She held her breath. In the silence, a mutual understanding passed between them. The contract, the rules, the social obligations, all faded into irrelevance. Then, gently, naturally, Jackson brushed a strand of hair from her face and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, unassuming, yet charged with the energy of everything they had withheld, all the tension, all the curiosity, all the fragile trust that had developed in the past days. Ella responded, cautious yet willing, feeling a thrill of authenticity she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. When they finally pulled back, the bookstore felt warmer, quieter, charged with a new intimacy. Jackson's grin returned, softer this time. "Not bad for a day of work," he teased. Ella laughed, the sound lighter than before. "We're breaking rules already," she said. "And enjoying it," he countered. The rest of the afternoon passed in an unstructured, almost surreal calm. They walked along quiet streets, talked about books and dreams, and shared small, unplanned gestures, holding doors, adjusting scarves, offering the other a sip of coffee. Each action blurred the lines further, merging professional duty with personal connection. By evening, as they returned to the house, both knew something fundamental had shifted. The contract still existed, but now an undeniable, unspoken bond had formed, one that neither social media plan nor public scrutiny could contain. They were no longer merely PR manager and client. They were two people beginning to navigate the fragile, exhilarating territory of mutual attraction, trust, and the uncharted reality beyond the staged images. Back in the city, the rhythm of work resumed, but the calm that Ella had briefly tasted in the countryside was gone. Stella's shadow hung over every decision, every interaction, like an unseen hand manipulating the pieces on a board only she could see. Ella arrived at her office early, scanning the latest media updates. Jackson's images were circulating again, not scandalous, but tinged with insinuation. Subtle headlines hinted at impropriety. Are Hollywood sweethearts really what they seem? And behind the smiles, PR or romance? Ella's stomach tightened. She knew Stella had begun her quiet assault, probing for weaknesses. By mid-morning, the first concrete move landed. Ella's assistant, flustered and apologetic, handed her a USB drive, claiming a messenger had left it outside security. It's labeled confidential, ma'am," he stammered. Ella's instincts screamed caution, but curiosity and professional duty pushed her to examine it. Inside, she found a copy of her contract with Jackson, alongside a recording of a recent strategy session. The files had been taken from her own office, unauthorized, yet precise. Every private discussion she had had about the contract, about Jackson as a professional case and not a romantic partner, was there, meticulously documented. Her heart pounded as realization sank in. Stella had infiltrated her circle, accessed confidential materials, and now held the means to undermine her and Jackson publicly. Meanwhile, Jackson remained blissfully unaware, focusing on rehearsals for the film, joking with crew members, and brushing off reporters' offhand comments about his relationship. Ella could feel the tension building in her chest, the weight of responsibility pressing down. This was no longer about appearances. It was about control, reputation, and trust. She knew Stella would wait for the perfect moment, using the information as a weapon to strike just before the film's premiere. Ella spent hours analyzing the files, cataloging every potential vulnerability, and mentally preparing counter-strategies. Jackson, noticing her intensity, leaned against her desk. "You've got that look again," he said softly, genuine concern flickering in his eyes. "That look that says you're about to take on the world alone." Ella looked up, meeting his gaze. "I have to protect us," she said quietly. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about you, me, and what we're building." Jackson reached out, a rare gesture of connection, gripping her shoulder briefly. "Then let's do it together," he murmured, his voice low, steady, and reassuring. Over the next week, Stella's manipulations became more tangible. Rumors began to surface on social media. Anonymous posts insinuated Jackson's disloyalty and suggested that Ella's relationship with him was purely transactional. Journalists called with leading questions designed to provoke reaction. Ella and Jackson had to navigate each encounter with precision, knowing that one slip could give Stella exactly what she wanted. They developed unspoken signals, small cues to alert one another during interviews, press appearances, and even casual conversations. The stress tested their patience, their judgment, and, more importantly, the trust forming between them. Despite the tension, the shared struggle deepened their bond. Jackson, for the first time in weeks, sought Ella's guidance actively, relying on her judgment in ways he had never allowed before. Ella, in turn, found herself appreciating not just his charm, but his capacity for vulnerability and cooperation. Yet, the shadow of Stella loomed constantly. Ella realized that this was no longer a simple PR challenge. It was a psychological war, with a cunning adversary who had infiltrated their lives and intended to expose every weakness. The trap had been set, and the countdown had begun. Every misstep, every casual comment, every unguarded expression was potential ammunition. Ella closed her eyes for a moment, drawing a steadying breath. "We're ready," she whispered, almost to herself. And somewhere in the city, Stella smiled, knowing that her carefully laid plan was progressing perfectly, just as she had intended. The morning started like any other, with sunlight streaming through Ella's apartment, birds chirping faintly outside. But the calm was deceptive. By mid-morning, notifications exploded across every device, flashing headlines, trending hashtags, and viral videos. Ella's stomach sank as she scrolled. Every private conversation, every strategic note, every moment Jackson had trusted her as a person, compiled, edited, and released into the public eye. Stella's handiwork had gone live. Fake love, the largest tabloid screamed. PR stunt or scandal, the next asked, featuring side-by-side images of staged smiles and casual interactions from their past weeks. Jackson was already on set when the news broke, filming a crucial scene for the blockbuster. The director called a pause, assistants whispered, and cameras that were supposed to capture fiction now hovered over a very real tension. Ella rushed to the studio, heart pounding, aware that the media storm had shifted from manageable optics to career-threatening exposure. She found Jackson in his trailer, pacing, phone in hand. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by tight lips and narrowed eyes. "Ella, is this real?" he demanded, voice low but intense. "It's what Stella wants everyone to think," Ella said, keeping her own panic in check. "She leaked the contract and recordings. She's trying to destroy us." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and disbelief. "So, all of this, Yumi, the last few weeks, were just fuel for her fire?" Ella shook her head firmly. "No, this is real, but we need to act. Fast." The next hours were a whirlwind of damage control. Ella coordinated with publicists, legal teams, and social media managers, all while keeping Jackson focused and composed in front of cameras. Every interview required precise wording. Every public appearance demanded rehearsed spontaneity. But the strain was visible. Jackson struggled to maintain his usual charm, and Ella's calm exterior was thinning with exhaustion. Then came the breaking point. A live morning show had obtained clips from Stella's leak and aired them, spinning the story as evidence of manipulation and deceit. Jackson stared at the screen, jaw tight, eyes flicking toward Ella. "Why didn't you stop this?" he asked, voice edged with hurt. Ella's heart clenched. She realized that, despite every precaution, the trap had succeeded in hitting a vulnerable nerve. "I didn't create it," she said, voice firm but gentle. "I'm here now, and we can still manage it, together." But the damage was immediate. The studio called to demand an emergency meeting, questioning Jackson's reliability and suggesting that Ella's involvement might compromise his performance. Her own agency reprimanded her for ethical concerns over the leaked contract. They were both under assault from every professional angle, their reputations dangling precariously. In the chaos, their eyes met. For a moment, the world, the cameras, and the shouting staff fell away. It was just the two of them, standing amidst the wreckage Stella had orchestrated. Jackson's voice softened. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," he admitted, the vulnerability raw. Ella stepped closer, careful not to break any professional boundaries, and said, "Then trust me. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. Me. We'll get through this, together." He hesitated, then nodded slightly, acknowledging the fragile bridge of trust they were building in real time. But outside, the storm raged on, social media debates, viral hashtags, and endless speculation. Every misstep, every pause, was dissected. Ella and Jackson were no longer merely managing appearances. They were navigating a battlefield of perception, fighting to preserve not just careers, but the truth of what they had begun to build. By evening, after interviews, statements, and countless strategic moves, the immediate fire had been contained, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Jackson retreated briefly to his trailer, rubbing his face in exhaustion. Ella, exhausted herself, remained nearby, silently watching, protecting, and preparing for the next inevitable wave. In the quiet aftermath, both recognized a harsh truth. Their bond, tested by public scrutiny and betrayal, had strengthened, but the trust between them was now a delicate, living thing, fragile, precious, and essential for the battles that were still to come. The city felt different once the noise faded. After the last interview, the last emergency call, the last carefully worded statement, silence settled in. A heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed in from all sides. Ella sat alone in her apartment, laptop closed for the first time in days, phone turned face down on the table as if it might burn her if she touched it again. For years, crisis had been her natural environment. Chaos had always been something to organize, to shape, to control. This time, it had slipped through her fingers. By morning, the consequences were unavoidable. Her agency's decision arrived in a short, sterile email. Suspension pending internal review. Violation of ethical standards. No signature, no apology. Just an administrative guillotine. Ella read it once, then again, not because she didn't understand, but because she needed to feel the weight of it settle fully. This was the career she had built piece by piece. Long nights, strategic compromises, relationships treated as transactions. And now it was gone, not with an explosion, but with quiet finality. Across the city, Jackson sat in his apartment with the curtains drawn, the world reduced to dim light and unanswered messages. The studio's call replayed in his head, concerns about marketability, instability, risk. Words he had heard before, but never this close to the edge. The role he had fought for, trained for, believed might finally redefine him, now hung by a thread. But worse than the professional fallout was the doubt. The recordings echoed in his mind. Not the edits, not the headlines, but the sound of Ella's voice, calm and analytical, discussing him as a case. He knew context mattered. He knew Stella's hand was all over it. And yet, the seed had been planted. Had he ever stopped being part of a strategy? Ella didn't try to call him that night. Or the next. For the first time since they met, she did nothing. No damage control. No calculated outreach. She let the silence exist, because she finally understood that any move made from fear would only confirm the worst assumptions about her. Instead, she sat with the truth she had been avoiding. The contract had been real. The money had mattered. But somewhere between rehearsed smiles and unguarded conversations, the equation had changed. And she had failed to protect the one thing that could not be spun back into place: trust. On the third day, Ella opened an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. Not a planner. Not a strategy log, a personal one. The pages were filled with half-formed thoughts, doubts she never allowed herself to articulate. As she read, a pattern emerged: control as armor, distance as safety, professionalism as a substitute for honesty. She saw, with painful clarity, that while Stella had set the trap, Ella herself had built the conditions that made it believable. That realization hurt more than the headlines. By evening, a different kind of decision took shape. Not a counterattack, not a rebuttal. A surrender, not to the narrative, but to the truth. Ella contacted a journalist she trusted, one known not for spectacle, but for long-form interviews that lived or died on credibility. No exclusives, no conditions, just a conversation. The request was accepted within the hour. Meanwhile, Jackson watched the media cycle turn without him. His agent advised silence. His publicist urged restraint. Everyone wanted him to wait, to let the storm pass. But waiting felt like agreeing with a version of events that stripped him of agency. When he saw a brief notice online, Ella Moore to give first unscripted interview since Scandal, something shifted. Not hope, not relief. Curiosity edged with dread. The interview aired the next night. No dramatic lighting. No applause. Ella sat plainly dressed, posture composed but unguarded in a way cameras rarely captured. She spoke without notes. She explained the contract without defensiveness. She admitted to seeing Jackson initially as a professional obligation. She did not excuse it. She contextualized it. Then she crossed the line most PR professionals never would. She spoke about when it stopped being business. About realizing that the systems she had mastered were inadequate for something real. About losing her job and accepting that it was the price of telling the truth too late. She did not mention Stella by name until the end. when she calmly laid out the manipulations, the timing, the intent, facts, not accusations. And finally, she said the one thing no strategy would ever recommend. If Jackson believes I betrayed him, he has every right to walk away. This interview isn't to fix my image. It's to stop hiding behind one. Jackson watched from his darkened living room, remote forgotten in his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't relax. But the tight knot in his chest loosened, just slightly. Not because everything was resolved, but because, for the first time, Ella had stepped out from behind the role she played so well. The storm didn't end that night. Careers weren't magically restored, but something fundamental had shifted. Ella closed her laptop after the interview aired, exhaustion washing over her. Not the hollow kind she knew from burnout, but a quieter, heavier fatigue that came from choosing honesty without guarantees. Wherever Jackson was, whatever he decided, she had finally stopped managing the outcome. And in that surrender, she found something unfamiliar and terrifying. Peace. The morning after the interview, the city did not wake up transformed. There were no triumphant headlines, no sudden reversals of fortune. The media cycle slowed, recalibrated, searching for a new angle now that outrage had lost its sharpest edge. Some outlets framed Ella's interview as reckless honesty, others as a calculated risk disguised as confession. Ella didn't read any of it. For the first time in years, she let the narrative move without her steering it. She spent the day in her apartment, windows open, letting ordinary sounds, traffic, voices, the distant siren, remind her that life existed beyond damage control. She had nothing left to defend. Jackson, meanwhile, declined his agent's calls. He took a long walk through the city, moving without destination, replaying Ella's words not as sound bites, but as intention. What stayed with him wasn't the explanation of the contract or the exposure of Stella's tactics. It was the absence of performance. Ella hadn't tried to win him back. She hadn't asked for forgiveness. She had simply told the truth and accepted the cost. That restraint unsettled him more than any dramatic apology could have. By afternoon, the studio made its position clear. The blockbuster role was gone, not announced publicly yet, but inevitable. Too much uncertainty, too much risk. Jackson listened, thanked them, and ended the call without argument. Strangely, he felt lighter. The role had been a cage dressed up as validation, and losing it forced him to confront a question he had avoided for years. Who was he when the spectacle stopped? He answered that question by doing the one thing no one expected. He went to Ella. She was sitting on the floor of her living room when the knock came. Surrounded by boxes she had begun packing out of habit more than necessity. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, no entourage, no practiced smile, her breath caught. They stood in silence, the kind that no longer felt defensive or charged with misunderstanding. Just honest. I watched it, Jackson said finally. Ella nodded. I didn't expect you to. I didn't expect you to do it, he replied. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She simply said, I couldn't keep lying. Not to you. Not to myself. Jackson stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For the first time, he said quietly, I believed you weren't trying to manage the ending. Ella met his gaze. Because I wasn't. What followed wasn't a reconciliation wrapped in declarations or promises. They talked, slowly, carefully, about the contract, about the moments that had been real even when the foundation wasn't. Jackson admitted how deeply the doubt had cut, how easily the leak had aligned with his worst fears about being used. Ella listened without interrupting, without defending herself, understanding that trust could not be negotiated back into place. It had to be rebuilt, or not at all. When he finally said, I don't want to be someone's brand anymore, Ella answered without hesitation. Then don't be. There was no kiss, no dramatic embrace. Just the quiet acknowledgement that something honest could only grow if it wasn't rushed. Over the following weeks, the world shifted in smaller, more meaningful ways. Jackson turned down several high-profile offers and accepted a role in an independent film. Low budget, character-driven, no guarantees. It terrified him, which, he realized, was exactly why it mattered. Ella, officially cut loose from her agency, stopped chasing reinstatement. Instead, she began sketching the outline of something new. A firm built not on illusion management, but on transparency, boundaries, and consent. Fewer clients, harder conversations, Real consequences. It wasn't glamorous. It felt right. Stella's influence faded without a final showdown. Investigations followed quietly. Her narrative collapsed under scrutiny once it lost oxygen. She moved on to the next spectacle, as she always did. Ella and Jackson didn't celebrate that. They barely mentioned her at all. She had been a catalyst, not the core conflict. What mattered was what remained when the noise cleared. Their relationship unfolded without an audience. No announcements. No curated posts. Ordinary evenings, shared meals, conversations that didn't need to lead anywhere. Trust returned unevenly, in fragments. Earned, not assumed. And that made it stronger than anything scripted. The story didn't end on a red carpet or with applause. It ended in a quiet apartment, late at night, where two people who had been defined by performance finally chose presence. No contracts. No handlers. No roles to play. Just a new script, unwritten, and for the first time, entirely their own.